Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Hi, I'm Bill Adolph, the Majority Chair of the House Appropriations Committee. Joining me today is Speaker Sam Smith and Majority Leader Mike Turzai. I want to thank all of you for being here today as well. Today we will be introducing House Bill 1437, the House Republican budget proposal for the fiscal year 2013-2014. This House bill represents budget priorities of the House of Representatives. The total spending bill is $28.3 billion, which is a $578 million increase, or a 2.1% increase over last year's spending number. Some of the major highlights include a $100 million increase for basic education, which also includes $10 billion for total pre-K education. $10 billion. This is the highest amount of state funding ever. This budget also includes funding for 300 new state troopers. Restores health line items such as epilepsy, diabetes, and ALS. Includes the governor's priority for an additional $20 million to further reduce the waiting list for the intellectual disability services. Restores funds for the conservation districts, and it also increases funding for the Open Records Office. The House leadership has made it a priority to make sure we pass budgets on time. This will be our third straight on-time budget. It's necessary for us to introduce this legislation because of the House rules that we have require us to do so. By no means am I presenting this budget to you today as if this is the final budget. But because the facts that we have today, we have identified the priorities that we would like to see in the final budget. As a result, the budget uses revenue estimates updated since February, and also assumes a current law relative to pensions as well as the transportation issues. Negotiations on many of these issues are ongoing, and the outcome of these negotiations and policy considerations can still be incorporated in the final budget. As you may recall, the governor proposed a pension reform plan which resulted in a savings of approximately $175 million in his budget proposal, which came from further reducing employer collars. Since February, we have learned that there was a balance in the school employees' retirement appropriation for the fiscal year 11-12 and for the fiscal year 12-13, which added up to approximately $140 million. This appropriation balance offset a majority of the savings the governor assumed in his budget by further reducing the employer contributions rates. We then added dollars to many general government lines to cover the higher employer contribution rates on the SER side. Altogether, this means the immediate pension budget savings that the governor proposed in February were not required as part of this budget proposal. Pension reform remains an important issue, but the 2014 budget can move forward as we continue to study the best way to keep our pension system solvent and limit the burden pension costs on Pennsylvania taxpayers. At this time, I'd like to introduce Majority Leader Mike Turzai for comments, or Speaker Sam Smith, or we can just open it up for comments. Michael?
We're very appreciative of everybody to hear the importance of this budget proposal, and we'll open it up for questions.
Yes.
Bill, in past years, when you've gone into the budget under your chairmanship, you've proposed very small increases, sometimes as little as $100 million over the past. In the last 2 years, you actually cut and sort of had the Senate drag you up. This year, you're proposing a lot of, a big increase for a budget that's $520 million in the hole. Why are you guys starting out with such a high ceiling compared to your last 2 years, where you started with a low floor and made the Senate drag you up?
Well, Peter, number one, number one, I think if you're comparing this budget with the prior two budgets, the governor as well as the House and the Senate had to deal with the loss of federal stimulus money. A lot of times that is lost in an awful lot of the conversation. This budget is more than last year. Okay, it's over $28 billion. Still in the cost of living. I think our projections that we made last July are right on. I think we're going to see May's revenue to be better than what the IFO had predicted just a few weeks ago. And we're looking to be in a fairly good shape revenue-wise. And this is all based upon current revenue. And
What do you expect to be relative to their 520 below over the 2 years?
Where do we think we're going to be? Probably maybe $100 million short.
So $400 million better than their prediction.
I believe so. That should be very close.
Right.
This budget does not contemplate expansion of Medicaid, correct? And if that's correct, how much revenue do you think would come in if you did expand revenue? The Senate Democrats have said $180 million in this budget.
You are absolutely correct, Brad. This budget does not include any type of Medicaid expansion. As far as the numbers are concerned, we have not dwelled on those numbers because the governor hasn't made his decision yet. Obviously, we've had conversations with the governor. We've had conversations with the Senate regarding this. That is a discussion that the governor is in constant conversation with the federal government, asking tough questions and trying to get the best possible deal for the taxpayers of Pennsylvania. When and if the governor decides to expand Medicaid, then we're going to be taking a look at those figures.
Yeah, along the lines of the Medicaid question, you reduced the medical assistance outpatient by 170 million, I guess, and inpatient by a little bit less. Is there, how did you derive at picking where your cuts would be and where they wouldn't along that?
Yeah. Is Dave Donnelly present there? Dave, come on up. And these line items have been changing almost on a daily basis. Yeah, come on up. I'd like to introduce to you the House Republican Executive Director. Dave replaces the longtime director, Ed Nolan. So, Dave, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. Yeah, the reductions in inpatient and outpatient, they were in the governor's proposal. That's just reflective of going statewide on managed care. That's why capitation increases.
Tony?
Last week, the governor refused to rule out the possibility that he might link the budget to some of his other priorities, like liquor privatization, pensions, transportation. If he does that, can you still stand there and confidently predict that we're going to have an on-time budget again?
Well, here's the thing. The important issue is that we have a constitutional obligation to have the budget done by June 30th. And we're going to meet that constitutional obligation. We've done it the prior 2 years, and we're going to do it this year. Anybody who has in front of them a budget that is passed by the Senate and the House and then is agreed upon and meets our constitutional obligation, we fully expect that bill to be signed. And we fully expect to have it done just as we've had it done the last 2 years. In terms of other important issues that are before us, the House has passed a number of bills that are over in the Senate, including the privatization of sale of wine and spirits. They're having hearings with respect to those. There's no linkage. We have a constitutional obligation to make sure that a budget is passed on time, and we're going to meet that obligation.
But you're saying if the governor did say, I'm not going to sign a budget unless you give me those other things.
I absolutely do not foresee that happening in any shape or form, because we have a constitutional obligation to have our budget done by June 30th, and we're going to meet that
But if
obligation.
he did and you sent him a budget, do you think he would sign it?
We do.
Yeah, Tony, I've never heard the governor say that. I don't expect the governor to say that. The governor is as much concerned as we are in making sure that we have a budget on time. So, I think we're all on the same team there. Yes, Dan.
Is your transportation basically taking the normal slight additions, not taking any new transportation funding plans or bills into account?
That's correct. This budget is based upon current law.
And keep in mind, in the general fund, transportation is not funded through the general fund. I realize that the motor vehicle fund and the public transit fund going forward are also budgetary items. But the fact of the matter is I think in state and federal dollars, we're spending close to $7 billion annually on those transportation items today.
Bill, what is the, how much overall difference is there between your budget and the governor's budget? Number one, and number two, it looks like on basic ed, you're spending more, $10 million more than the governor wanted to do. Is that correct?
Yeah, Brad, we're roughly $110 million less than the governor's overall budget, and we are spending $10 million more than the governor's proposed $90 million, bringing it up to a $100 million increase in basic education.
And if I might, on total education spending alone in Pennsylvania in our budget of state dollars, for the 1314 and House Bill 1437, it's $10.3 billion. $10.3 billion on education, and that includes all elements of education. In addition, I think on basic ed alone, we're just shy of $6 billion. Is that correct, Dave?
Right, 5.5.
5.5, excuse me, 5.5 billion just on basic education for K through 12 is in this particular budget.
With the plans that you have for pension, are you basically conceding that you are not going to do pension reform prior to June 30th, the governor's pension reform plan prior to that time? And then as a follow-up, would you explain just in a little bit more detail what exactly these balances are and where you're finding the savings to make up for the $175 million?
Bill, you
Yeah.
turn, then I want to follow up on that.
No, the answer to your first question is no. As the chairman made in his opening comment, this budget's based on the revenue realities that have changed since the governor's proposed budget in February, and it's also based on current law. Certainly, the reform to the pension system are important, but in reality, any reforms to the pension plan, if they were enacted today, don't directly affect this document as a general fund budget. Any reforms have impacts in the out years more so than in the current year. What this budget reflects is current law, Act 120 I think it is, and that we are meeting our obligation under that law in terms of the employer contribution side of that equation. And any reforms, while you might refinance your current debt obligation to the pension systems, which could have an effect on a budget, they don't really change, it doesn't change your actual, amount of money the taxpayer owes to those pension funds today.
So no, you are not going to do the governor's reform pension.
No, that's not what I said. I said this does not say we're not doing anything on that. It says this is the cards we have to deal with right now, so we're playing this hand. And certainly, if an agreement is struck between pension reforms, they can be enacted and literally could have zero impact on this current budget. Now, the way the governor proposed it, it arguably would. But there's been other changes, as the chairman noted, in terms of our actual obligation under Act 20, and particularly to the state, the school teachers' retirement system. And so the way the governor proposed it, it would, but he basically is doing he proposes, a restructuring of the collars, lowering the collars as part of his savings in his proposed budget. So we're not ruling that out. We're just saying at this point in time, these are the facts we have to deal with. This is the current law, so this budget is based on that fact.
Yeah, Angela, the pension, the wages are less statewide, and we are following the current Act of 120, Act 120. And as the other revenue, I think, since February, the revenue is better than what the governor and what the IFO expected. Okay, and that is not what the governor projected, less than what the governor. But but more than what the IFO had. And also, we're projecting a little increase in revenue growth at 1.5%, and that's a conservative figure. I think that the tax refunds as well. The tax refunds are not going to be as high as what the governor had projected earlier. So combination of half a dozen items, but obviously the biggest thing is the change in the lower wages for the school employees.
But the key component is we are meeting our obligation to PSERS and SERS. We're meeting it.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you elaborate on that $140 million that's going to offset the savings that the governor had proposed?
The school teachers' retirement number down because
we are paying the rate is 16.9%, okay, of a total wage figure. Over the last couple years, the total wages have come down statewide for school employees. As a result, you're multiplying 16.9 by a smaller number. And that way, it's saving us approximately $140 million.
A lot of that was a reaction to the loss of the federal stimulus money. When you hear over the last year and a half that education was cut, the reality of that was the federal stimulus money going away and not being available in those budgets. And if you also recall, I think it was at the end of the first budget cycle that there was a request that the governor basically made to teachers to maybe forego an increase or at least try to get those rising costs of salaries under control a little bit. And there was a reaction that is reflected in this number. In other words, the total number of wages, generally the state pays half of the school teacher's retirement, the local taxpayer, the school boards pay the other half, generally, not exactly, but kind of, on average. So because their wages, their total gross wages across the state is less than what was anticipated, that's what generated the $140 million less that we would be obligated to pay into the system than what was projected, say, 6 months or a year ago.
And the two key points really are, in terms of state dollars for public education K through 12, in terms of state dollars, we have, even in the first budget cycle, we increased state dollars. It is true the federal stimulus money was gone, particularly in that first year. We had to adjust to deal with it. And the second point is this: we are meeting our obligation to PSERS and SERS as it exists under Act 120. We are meeting that obligation, and we believe that's important.
4 years ago, when the budget went like 100 days late at being passed under the previous administration, I think it was 4 years ago, this was the whole debate. That was the reason that budget was unsettled for such a long time, because the current administration wanted to roll all that stimulus money into more or less operating costs, knowing that one day those stimulus monies would not be available. And the only thing that would save us from that is if the economy had come roaring back. Well, it didn't. So that created that billion-dollar kind of gap of this governor's first budget year that created this whole stir of education and other elements being cut by such huge numbers. It was the loss of the federal stimulus money that we fought about. I think it was 4 years ago in the previous administration.
Yeah.
Your budget assume that the Human Services Block Grant is for all counties, or does it keep it at 20 or up at 30?
There's no change in that. We haven't changed the policy. Right now, it's for the 20 counties. That's a policy decision. We've gotten some good feedback, but there's some thought. We may want to take a look at the report that's going to come back and see how everything's going. But as far as this current budget that we are proposing, there's no change from last year. Yes, sir.
If liquor passes in June, do you think that money will affect this budget, and if so, how?
No, I do not believe it impacts this particular budget.
Right.
I'm sorry. Thank you. No, I do not believe that it impacts this particular budget. That would be going forward, because the first revenues that you would see would come from the divestiture of wholesale, and that would be at least a year out. And if you look at the bill in detail as we passed it out of the House, it's essentially a 5-year transition. Wholesale does come first, And you would see some upfront money. Every analysis says it's around $600 million. But even so, it would be at least a year out.
Dennis?
As a follow-up to that, last week Senator Costa said that House Republicans were linking transportation to liquor privatization. A, is that true? Can you comment on that? But B, if that doesn't happen with the rush of the budget, what's the likelihood either of those gets done if it's not with the budget?
Yeah, there's absolutely no linkage on our part. I always think it's interesting with Senator Costa. I think he always wants to do linkage, and then he just says the opposite. It's interesting. No, look, we passed the privatization bill on March 21st. It's been over in the Senate since that time. There has not been a transportation bill passed yet out of the Senate. The Senate will need to pass their Senate Bill 1 to get that on the table, but there is not a bill on the table in the House. Look, they're going to rise and fall on their merits. And the budget, in and of itself, we have a constitutional obligation to meet it. I know I said it before, but it's true. By June 30th, we will have a budget done that the governor can sign.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain why you decided to increase the Senate and House budgets by 1.5% after the governor kept it flat?
Well, when you review our expenses, that's what was needed in order to balance the budget.
And it was tied to all the other, the row officers and the governor's office, just a general 1.5, I believe it's 1.5% increase to those general operating budgets of the other, the row officers and the governor's office in general.
And the judiciary.
And the judiciary, excuse me. I knew there was something I was missing.
So you saw that flat increase in all the agencies and not the ledge, or?
No, we increased. We proposed, this budget proposes to increase all of those by the same number, 1.5%. The judiciary, the three row offices, and the governor's office itself.
So there were no other savings to be found then, in terms of incidentals or mileage, anything like that?
Well, we did, I mean, we've been looking for savings and have been making significant savings in the House Republican. In fact, from when the Democrats controlled, before we took over in 11-12, we reduced per diem expenditures by almost $2 million annually. In addition, as you know, when we took charge, along with the bipartisan management vote, we moved every House member and staff that now contributes to health insurance, which did not occur under the Democrats' control. We made significant strides in reducing expenditures, but I think 1.5% across the board, particularly judiciary, the row offices, and the legislature is a good policy, and it's beneath the overall increase of 2.1% that we have put on the table in overall increase in spending.
It appears that the fund for the Act 47 cities, that you have a 40% cut. I know the governor bumped it up a lot this year, but does that reflect any kind of lack of need for it, or?
Yeah, that's the governor's reduction. Mr. Donnelly informs me that was a one-time increase last year, and we just went with the governor's proposal.
Brad.
I have a question for Speaker Smith. Just to clarify, when you said you're not ruling out pension reform, and you could do it and not necessarily have an impact on this budget, were you referring to maybe doing 401ks for new employees in the future, which would have no impact now?
Well, I was not excluding that. However, even adopting the governor's proposal with regard to current employees doesn't directly affect this year's budget. So, I mean, I'm not taking anything off the table, but my point is that any pension reforms that might be enacted just don't have a big impact on our current debt obligation, our unfunded liability within the pension system. That number is there. It's a somewhat fixed number. The two challenges with pension reform are, one, how do you reform the system in a fair and equitable manner going forward, which starts to solve your problem really literally 20 years out. And number two, the second part is how do you manage the current unfunded liability that exists. So that doesn't affect this year's budget directly. That's all I meant by that.
Time for one more, last question?
Yeah, you've mentioned a couple of ways in which this diverges from the governor's budget. Are there other ones in addition to the ones you've already mentioned where you have a divergence from what the governor proposed?
Well, I think the comparison that we're making is from last year's budget.
Yes.
Okay? And that's where we deal from. And we took into consideration some of the governor's line items. Obviously, the governor, the waiting list was very important for the governor. Obviously, the governor's proposal had $90 million increase. We saw that we could increase it by another $10 million. The state troopers, which is a highlight of one of the governor's proposals, we kept that. So there's many, many line items that if we lined up ours with the governor, you're probably going to see 85% of those line items, Pete, and I'm making up that percentage, very similar. But we kept it the same figure as what the governor had proposed.
And Pete, just to end, the key thing is we built it, just as the chairman said, we built it off the 2012-13 budget. And secondly, because there has been a change in what the revenue picture was since the governor put a proposal out in February. And then secondly, we are increasing. It's a very responsible budget. It's a fair budget. It's a budget that does well in terms of our most vulnerable citizens and does well in terms of public education. But it is also a responsible budget. It increases spending by about 2.1%, almost $600 million annually from last year's budget. It prioritizes it. It's responsible, and we're proud of the product that we're going to be putting out.
I think is that the last question? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.